Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Trial of Gwen Foley by Jane O'Connor, narrated by Lucy Brownhill. There are, in every age, new errors to be rectified, and new prejudices to be opposed. Samuel Johnson, 1751. Lichfield, Staffordshire, 1723. 1. Earth. The gallows went up in Shawbut's Lane late Sunday afternoon, and cast a dark shadow over the road into town. Nobody wanted poor Joanna to hang. He had been a brutal man, her William. We had all borne witness to her hobbling up Rotten Row, a scarf hiding her swollen face. Who among us could blame her for rubbing arsenic on her husband's eyelids as he slept, until one morning he never awoke? Where she got the toxin, I don't know. But Dr. Crouch said it was the cause of death, because of the stripes on William's fingernails and the pallor of his skin. So it was deemed murder, with his wife and bedfellow the only suspect. Matthew had gone to speak to Joanna, hoping he could find a way to exonerate her. But she had confessed all to him, even as her children plucked at her clothes and beseeched her to stop. He'd had no choice then but to take her to Guildhall jail, to wait for the Assizes Court to make its way down from the north and decide on her punishment. No more than 3 or 4 minutes did Joanna's trial last in the end, despite Matthew urging the judge to consider the mitigations put forward by her sister Agnes about William's cruelty, and to take into account the dire situation of her children. The judge wasn't disposed to listen. It didn't help matters that Matthew was only the acting magistrate in his brother's absence, nor that it was coming towards luncheon. He put his stomach before compassion. That's how Amber put it in her usual direct manner, as it seemed to us the judge passed his dreadful sentence in haste, clearly aggrieved that he'd had his feeding delayed. "Murder is murder," he'd said, interrupting Matthew's carefully prepared speech in Joanna's defence, and striking his anvil on the splintered table that was as old as the Guildhall itself. "The woman has confessed. Therefore she will hang, and let her demise be of instruction to any other disobedient wives in this city who take it into their heads to dispatch of a displeasing husband. That is my final decision in adherence with the laws of this country and the dictates of the king." The judge had pulled his tricorn on over his wig and bustled out the door before the booing of the gathered crowd could reach him, and that was the end of the matter. It had broken my heart to see Agnes run after him down the street, sobbing and begging him to reconsider his verdict. But it had done no good, and the judge had threatened to have her swinging beside her sister if she didn't desist from her petition. Matthew had presided over Joanna's execution, the first under his jurisdiction, the following Monday. My husband had no stomach for such affairs, gentle soul that he was, and spent the nights in between sleepless with angst over her fate. It was at least fortunate, if it can be called such, that the nature of Matthew's impediments meant that he needed an arm to steady him as well as his stick, so I had reason to accompany him on his official duties, and it gave him courage and strength to have me by his side. That bitter Monday morning, though, I would have paid the devil himself to stay safe at home with liberty, and close my mind altogether to the miserable happenings on Shawbut's Hill. It was with the greatest reluctance that I put aside my embroidered dresses and red cloak, and clothed myself in black, my auburn hair hidden under a cowl. Matthew wore his full regimental uniform, and looked almost his old self tidied up so, despite his wooden leg. I held Matthew's elbow firmly as we made our way up to the raised area of the gallows, and felt him tremble as the guards led the pitiful woman from the cart to the wooden platform where the single noose awaited her. Joanna tripped and stumbled along the muddy path, her legs barely able to carry her, and I had to avert my eyes for fear I would cry out at the cruelty of her treatment and cause an embarrassment to Matthew in front of the city's dignitaries. Joanna had been in the jail for weeks awaiting trial, and her clothes and face were streaked with grime. Amber and I had gone to see her several times, bringing food and reading matter, as we always do for those poor souls who find themselves in such a situation. Joanna had tried hard to keep her spirits up for the sake of her children, although she knew the fate that awaited her, as did we all. "Perhaps there will be a pardon for me from King George," she had said on our final visit the day before her hanging. She grabbed onto my wrist as I made to leave, her red-rimmed eyes beseeching me to agree. I had nodded, sharing her hope of a last-minute reprieve, but not truly believing such a miracle to be possible. As Joanna climbed up the steps of the scaffold, I found myself staring out at St. John's, the road that led to London, willing a lone horseman to appear on the horizon, wearing the colours of the crown, and clutching a scroll with the king's seal. What jubilation there would have been had that occurred. But alas, no such pardon came, and Joanna's life drew to its unnatural end. Matthew had barely voice enough to read the indictment. He had to state the judge's verdict twice. A clutch of starlings rose noisily from the copse behind us during his first attempt, as if the birds themselves were protesting at the injustice of Joanna's fate. His accountabilities finally completed, Matthew bowed his head, and the Reverend Mr. Brown moved forward to preach to the condemned woman from his prayer book. He stood close and spoke directly into her ear. She inclined towards him, and it seemed that his holy words were a comfort to her, if only for a brief amount of time. The hangman stepped up behind them onto the gallows before any one of us was ready for it, and Joanna gasped at the sight of him. The vicar reached out then and took a hold of Joanna's hand, and continued with his ministrations until Sheriff Michael Johnson lumbered up from his seat at the side of the gallows, and with a panicked wave of his arm shouted, "No contact with the deceased permitted." Samuel, his son, who was sitting next to him, lowered his face in shame, and I felt it a pity that the sheriff had required the company of the boy on such an occasion. The Reverend Mr. Brown dropped Joanna's hand, and she let out a cry as the last human contact she was to have on this earth was taken from her. The vicar glanced towards the spires of the great cathedral, which overlooked the city, and shook his head as if in disappointment that God himself would allow such a thing. I wondered if he had lost his faith somewhere on life's journey, as I had myself. Joanna didn't speak a word as the noose was placed around her neck. Her gaze was fixed on the front row of the crowd, where stood her 3 oldest children, along with her sister Agnes. The biggest boy and girl were in much distress as the trapdoor was released, and Joanna's head jerked upwards. But Joanna's other boy, who couldn't have been more than 11, was silent and still, frozen in fury as he watched his mother choke and die. I was flooded with pity, but I knew the trouble it would cause Matthew if I was to interfere in the proceedings or speak my mind aloud. It cost me much effort, though, to bite my tongue and keep the expression on my face a passive one. Most in the crowd had the decency to lower their heads as young Samuel Johnson had done, but a few empty-headed lobcocks jeered and shouted, "Witch!" throwing turnips and clods of earth as Joanna jerked and swung. They should have been ashamed of themselves, adding cruel acts and wicked slurs to the indignities already wrought upon her. Matthew stood firm until the deed was done, and the townsfolk began to make their way back up the hill in a melancholy silence, broken only by the occasional mutter of shame and God's mercy on her. When the last of them had turned the corner, Matthew bent over, leaning hard on his stick, and retched onto the stony ground. "Take me home, Hetty," he whispered as I helped him right himself. Sheriff Johnson was overseeing the loading of Joanna's body onto the gravedigger's cart, Samuel standing awkwardly beside him. So we slipped away to the other side of the common ground, where we were grateful to see George waiting for us with a carriage, ready to take us home. I was helping Matthew up onto the bench when I sensed someone standing behind me. I turned and saw that it was Agnes, the hanged woman's sister, fixing me with a stare so piercing that I was rooted to the spot. "My dear, how sorry we are. I began as I reached out my hand to take hers. "Don't touch me," she said, snatching her arm away. I was confused, quite taken aback by the scornful cast of her eyes. "You should be ashamed of yourself, Hester Albright. You pride yourself on being a good woman of this city, always ready to help those in need. But for my defenceless sister you did nothing. You stood there with your lips pressed tightly together and a pious expression on your face, and you watched my Joanna hang from a gibbet. And for what? For the crime of defending herself and her children against her brute of a husband." I put my hand to my heart, stunned at her anger towards me. "Agnes, please," I beseeched her. "I share your distress and condemnation of what has taken place, but you must understand there was nothing I could have done to prevent Joanna's death." She shook her head, and, as she pushed her dark hair from her face, I saw how much she looked like her sister. "You have his ear." Agnes pointed up at Matthew, who was watching the scene, aghast from his seat in the open carriage. "You could have acted or spoken in Joanna's favour. You could have tried. You could have at least added your voice to mine. I'd wager you would have spoken up if it had been your sister." I flinched at that, but stopped my mind turning towards Nell. I thought instead of how Agnes had had the courage to beg the judge to reconsider his verdict on Joanna, and of my own silence both at the trial and today. "Let me try to explain," I began, wanting to make Agnes understand how it had been impossible for me to help because of my loyalty to Matthew, and my deep fear of bringing difficulties to our own family. But she was in no humour to listen. "Shame on you," she said, and my soul withered at her words. She spat on the ground at my feet, and walked back to where Joanna's children were huddled together waiting for her. I climbed into the carriage and sat flushed and speechless on the bench next to Matthew, as George urged the mare up the hill. "My dear," he said, reaching for my hand, "don't let Agnes upset you. She's not in her right mind. Who would be at such a time?" I stared ahead as the familiar buildings of the city rose up before us, and the disgrace of Agnes's accusation seeped into my bones. "Perhaps she is right," I said slowly, as the great cathedral came into view. "How can I call myself a good woman and stay quiet in the face of such injustice as we witnessed today?" Matthew furrowed his brow. "Because you know as well as I that women who forget their place and speak out against the customs and laws of the land bring trouble to themselves and their families. We want no trouble brought to our door. Think of our own daughters." "I am thinking of them," I said anxiously, pulling my shawl tighter against the chill morning air. "What if one day Esme or Liberty or even Amber found themselves in a deathly predicament, and there was no one to protect them or act on their behalf?" "I understand that you are upset by what we had to witness today. God knows we both are," Matthew said, lowering his head at the memory. "But I have been burdened with an official role in this city, and, until Philip returns, I'm duty-bound to fulfill it." "I feel ashamed, Matthew," I said in a hollow voice. "I can't do that again." "Then next time, as unfortunately there will undoubtedly be a next time, you will stay safely at home with Liberty," Matthew said kindly, as George rode us past the market square and up into Dam Street. "I'm sorry if it was too much to ask of you to accompany me today, but you know how much I needed you there, my dear, and I thank you for that." "No," I said, realising that he'd misunderstood me. "I mean that I can't stand by and do nothing the next time a woman is punished so unjustly. I must at least try and find a way to prevent such a thing." My voice wavered as I spoke, but I nodded at the conviction I felt. Matthew looked at me with concern, and patted my hand as if I'd fallen into a sort of madness. I'm certain he expected me to forget my intention as time moved us on and away from the dreadful spectacle of Joanna's death. But it stayed with me like a tiny burning ember, hidden deep inside, fueled by my dismay and guilt at Agnes's indictment against me. 2. Coins. On my way to market several days later, I made a visit to the Johnsons' bookshop on Breadmarket Street to see my friend Sarah, and to return to her some volumes she had lent me. I was not to know it then, but an unusual visitor to the shop that day would set in motion events that would change all of our lives forever, and ignite the ember of shame inside me into a flame of action. Michael was out front when I arrived, berating the postboy for being late with his letters. I watched him finish his tirade and storm back up the steps into the shop, cross as ever with the world and everyone in it. His body and features matched his temperament well, I always thought, he being a large, gloomy man with a fleshy face and lips, bushy eyebrows and bulging eyes. He rarely smiled, and seemed to find all aspects of his bookshop business a burden, even though he had the enviable honour of publishing books as well as selling them. And Michael Johnson seemed to find little satisfaction in his role as Sheriff of Lichfield. I often wondered why he'd chosen to take on such a position of responsibility. I could only imagine it fulfilled in him some deeply held desire to be a figure of importance in the city, born from the hidden complexities of his character. Sarah was a quiet mouse of a woman with a good heart, fortified by her strong faith. She suited Michael well, and he was lucky to have her, in my opinion. She worried constantly about their oldest boy, Samuel, whom she didn't bear until she was 40, having almost given up hope of ever becoming a mother. Samuel was 14 by then, and, unlike his younger brother Nathaniel, who was a cheerful, even-tempered lad, Sam was beginning to show signs of the melancholic like his father, although it has to be said that he was altogether more genial. Sam's skin was ugly, though. Blighted with scrofula he was, poor soul. Sarah and Michael were so perturbed by it that when Sam was small they had taken him to London to receive the royal touch from Queen Anne. But despite their high hopes, the condition had remained much the same so far as I could tell. It was a shame, as his affliction made Samuel reluctant to be in company, and he tended towards hiding at home with his books, rather than skylarking around the town with Nathaniel and the other boys his age. "Good morning, Sarah," I said as I came through the door, setting the bell tinkling. "How goes you this fine day?" Sarah gave me a watery smile, but I could see her eyes were troubled. "I am well enough, Hester, although I have not been able to find solace since Joanna Baker met her end. Those poor children, orphans all. How many did she have? 6, was it?" I reached over the counter and took her thin hand in mine, rubbing it gently. "She leaves 7 children," I said quietly. "Amber is collecting money and clothes for them as she makes her rounds today. I will ask her to visit your shop so you can add to the offerings." Sarah nodded. "And we must pray for them," she said. "Yes, that too," I agreed mildly, although to my mind Amber's plan had more use to it. "How is Samuel?" I asked, laying aside the talk of Joanna's children that saddened us both. "I saw him at Shawbut's Lane at the hanging." "He was most upset by having to accompany his father. Michael insisted, though. Said the sooner youngsters face up to the harsh realities of breaking the law, the better. Sam has been suffering again with his skin since then, God relieve him. He has been itching at it at night, and it is inflamed and causing him grief." Sarah creased her brow in angst. "Have you tried using a poultice of figwort?" I asked her, pulling a package of dark green leaves from my basket. "I picked this from the thicket by Minster Pool. I read about its uses, and here." I placed a book of herbal remedies on the counter, along with the other volumes I was returning. Sarah took the figwort from me gingerly and put it to her nose. "Oh, it smells fetid," she said, recoiling in disgust. "Take no heed of the odour of it. It is said to be balm to enraged skin." Amber says it will do your Samuel no harm if it's not effective. Sarah's face brightened. Thank you. I will try it on him this evening. He's reading now and will not be disturbed. She leant forward and told me quietly, if he would spend more time outside in the fresh air and the sunshine, I think it would do his skin more good than sitting in reading always, just like his father. But he takes no heed of my advice. Young people of today lack the obedience that we adhered to. Don't you think? I nodded in sympathy, although I couldn't in truth agree with her. Not after the mighty defiance my sister and I had showed our father when we were of a similar age. They find their own way. You couldn't be a more dedicated mother, I told her. Sarah wiped her nose with her handkerchief and gave me a small smile of gratitude. I do my best with the grace of God. And how fare your children, Hester? Is little Liberty been good? Have you heard from John? And how is Esme? She must be nearing her time, is she not? My stomach clenched as she asked after Esme, but I made efforts to answer her inquiries in the same pleasant spirit in which they were asked. Liberty seems to be settling into Dame Oliver's school, and we are thankful for that. We received a letter from our John only yesterday, saying he and Ruth and the little ones have taken a cottage next to her father's farm. The Welsh air suits him, he says, and he feels at home there, but he wishes it would stop raining. The rain is God's blessing, said Sarah. I do believe it is easier to be of that opinion from inside a warm bookshop in Lichfield than it is on the side of a Welsh mountain, I said playfully, and Sarah let out a rare, surprisingly loud laugh that she hid behind her hand. Michael's grey curly head appeared from the top of the cellar steps at the sound. "Hush up!" he admonished us. "I must have silence as I take stock of the newly arrived books." "And Esme?" Sarah whispered as her husband's head disappeared again from view. "Esme fares well," I said, nodding. "As well as can be expected," I conceded with a worried sigh. "She is such a slight girl, though. Her belly sticks out from her like a pumpkin, and her back bothers her greatly with the weight. I hope constantly that she has a safe delivery. She seems too young still to become a mother herself." "You must have been younger than Esme when you had Amber," Sarah reminded me. "And all was well." I went to speak, but decided against it, not wanting to lie to my friend. "You will be with her when her time for childbed comes, along with the midwife, and Amber too, I'm sure, if she can be spared by Dr. Crouch. I will pray for dear Esme and her child." I thanked her and pulled my red cloak around me. "I nearly forgot," I said, pulling a couple of coins from my dress pocket. "Could I have a small bottle of ink and a few sheets of writing paper? There is a letter I've been meaning to write for some time." Sarah nodded and placed the items in my basket. "You'll be writing back to your John, no doubt," she said. "Do remember him to me and pass on my best wishes." As I turned to leave, the door from the street burst open, causing the bell to jangle loudly. A short, handsomely dressed gentlewoman strode confidently into the shop and up to the counter. "Do you have any books on science?" she asked as she pulled off her green silk gloves, the bell still tingling behind her. Sarah stared at the woman in bewilderment and couldn't find her voice, so I stepped forward to help. "What in particular interests you, my lady?" I asked, taking in her rich velvet jacket and the large purse of coins which hung at her belt. She tutted in irritation. "I want books about science. Did you not hear me?" She had such an abrupt, unpleasant manner, so unlike most visitors to the bookshop who tended to be meek, polite types, that I had to subdue a smile. "My daughter and we hear my husband and his associates talking about Copernicus and the planets and Isaac Newton and these laws that govern the natural world, and we are fascinated," she said, emphasizing the final word as her eyes wandered over the shelves. "I'm tired of superstition and balderdash about witchcraft, magic, and the like. There is dangerous nonsense being talked in our village even now, about a woman they call the White, and claim is a witch. I will tolerate none of it, and have warned my household that if I hear anyone spreading such rumours, they will be dismissed. I want to learn the truth behind the mysteries of the world and the planets, and so does my daughter. My husband won't tell us what he knows. He says it's not for women to concern themselves with such things." She looked at me imploringly, and I could see sorrow in her sharp brown eyes. "But we simply must know. Claudia is deeply curious, and she has a quick mind, far quicker than her brother's. She desperately wants a telescope, but I have no idea how to procure such an item, so I promised her I would get books instead so we can teach ourselves. I cannot bear for her to spend her life sewing and simpering, unaware of the scientific elucidations and revelations which are becoming common knowledge to the educated men in our circles." She reached into her purse and drew out a pair of delicate silver-framed spectacles, which she placed over her eyes, magnifying them greatly. She clipped the centrepiece tightly onto her nose to keep them in place, and pursed her lips in anticipation of our response. "Well, you've come to the right place," I said, admiring her courage to go against her husband's wishes. "Michael Johnson has the finest bookshop in Staffordshire." I wanted to ask her more about the rumblings about witchcraft in her village, but missed my chance, as Michael arrived noiselessly by the lady's side, and she turned to give him her attention. "Can I be of service, madam?" he asked with a bow, drawn up from his stock-taking once again, this time by the amount of coin he sensed this illustrious customer intended to spend in his shop. I gave Sarah a friendly wink and made my way out and down the stairs into the street, where quite a commotion was being caused by the lady's grand carriage and four blocking the way into the marketplace. I glanced up at the shop and noticed Samuel standing at one of the top windows, gazing out over the chaotic scene with interest, but he withdrew back into the room, out of sight, when he saw me waving at him. I returned to our little black and white house at the end of the row on Dam Street around noon, and found Matthew huddled over his books by the unlit hearth in the parlour. "Do you not feel the chill, my love?" I asked him as I placed kindling and coal in the grate. "You should have asked Sal to set the fire for you. That's what we pay her for, and she's more than willing if you instruct her clearly." "Hetty," he said, as if surprised to see me there in our own house. "I was quite lost in Homer. I'm teaching Sir Dalstan's sons this afternoon, and thought to try and introduce some appreciation of poetic language into their lesson." I smiled at his optimism and tied my apron around me. I pulled a bundle of lavender stems wrapped in a linen cloth out of my bag and held them to my nose, before pulling off the flower heads and dropping them into an earthenware bowl. "You make lavender essence when someone is hurt," Matthew said, concerned. "Are you thinking of Esme?" I began working the pestle and nodded. "She may need it after childbed, to help with the healing." Matthew watched me as I worked. "You are a caring woman," he said. "That is your essence. You look after us all." I nodded, although I had been perturbed by what the lady in the bookshop had said about witchcraft rumours starting up in her village. I was about to tell Matthew once again of my desire to act against injustices meted out to women in the locality, but was interrupted before I began by the front door scraping open across the flagstones. A clear, fresh light entered the room, along with some cheery street noise as Amber strode across the parlour and grabbed a piece of bread from the table. Matthew's face lit up, and I could see that his spirits were raised by the presence of our oldest daughter, as people's often were. "I am in need of this," she said, taking a bite of the crust. "I haven't had a morsel to eat since dawn. I've sewn up a grog-souse fellow who thought it a lark to jump from the clock tower, treated a farrier's burnt hands, and made a poultice for Mrs. Evesham's carbuncles, and it's not yet noon." Matthew and I looked at her fondly, familiar as we were with the enthusiasm and dedication Amber had for her work as apprentice to the city's surgeon. "By the way, Liberty is outside playing with a mange-ridden cat," she said, reaching for the jam. "I think she means to bring it inside and make a pet of it." Matthew struggled to his feet and grabbed his stick. "No more stray animals in this house," he said. "That ferret she kept hidden in her room ate through one of my best
Sample complete. Ready to continue?